Today, you will listen in on my conversation with Elizabet Hamblett, a college learning disability specialist. She's going to walk us through what students with IEPs and 504 plans in high school can expect as they transition to college. She is a wealth of knowledge. And if you have a child with learning challenges who's thinking about attending college within the next couple of years, you don't want to miss this.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Today, my guest is Elizabet Hamblett. Elizabet has been a college learning disability specialist at the college level for 2 decades. In addition to working at a university, she is a nationally requested speaker and understood expert on preparing students with disabilities for successful college transition. Elizabet is the author of a fantastic book, From High School to College, Steps to Success for Students with Disabilities. And her work has appeared in numerous journals and online platforms. I am so thrilled to have her here with me today. Welcome to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast, Elizabet.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. How are you doing?
Good. It's a somewhat gray and rainy day here on the East Coast, but having a chance to talk to somebody brightens up my day.
Well, wonderful. That's great. And I'm glad to be having this discussion with you because of kind of the area that you work. Because what that means for me is that there are kids, young adults who have struggled with learning issues for some time, have got the intervention, the accommodations, the modifications, and they've gotten to the point where they now can not only apply to college, but be admitted into college or university. And so that's exciting for me because so many families, when they get the initial diagnosis, if there is a diagnosis, the question is often, will my child be able to go to college or will they be successful in college? But sometimes they're even worrying about them finishing high school. So this is such a big accomplishment for students who learn differently, think differently, who have a diagnosed learning disorder. So I'm excited to talk to you because of the area in which you work.
Well, and I think you've identified, part of what's so exciting for me about what I do is, as you say, sometimes families have these worries and, there's a lot of things that they should know and, should recognize that students are going to colleges of all stripes, all kinds of schools, small private schools and big state universities, all throughout the range.
Absolutely. And, you and I both work with students who have these learning challenges and challenges that impact academic performance. And so I want to jump right in because, on my end, I help kind of identify the learning challenges, the learning disorders, if they're there. And I help recommend accommodations and modifications that students have been using in elementary school and high school. And now they get to the point where they're transitioning to college. And some of those students may have IEPs or 504 plans. And I want to ask you about this because a lot of parents ask this question. What are some misconceptions in kind of what you're seeing that families have about a high school IEP or a high school 504 plan? And what can students expect when applying to and beginning college when they've had these plans in place in high school?
So great place to start because I agree there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, and sort of sometimes the nuance of some of these issues gets lost when people, talk to each other. And so it's really important that families have the correct information. So some families may be aware that IEPs don't transfer to college because IDEA, the law that under which IEPs are written, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, does not cover colleges. So if you went through and you looked at the full text of IDEA, which would take you a long time, you won't ever see the wording that says, and therefore your plan ends here, but that is essentially the effect of it. So I do find in talking to parents that sometimes they do know that, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about 504. And again, it's quite understandable. 504 does apply to both, K through 12 and colleges. But what a lot of people don't know, and where the nuance is lost, is that high schools are under, K through 12 is under subpart D, and colleges are under subpart E. And those mandates are actually quite different. And so there's a lot of things that we do in K through 12 that colleges are not required to do. And if you think about things that are obvious just from the initial question about child find, so colleges don't have to look for students who might have a disability, and they don't have to identify them and test them to see whether they're eligible for accommodations. And that's kind of a big thing. And before we go down that road of those differences, so essentially, the 504 plan also expires when your kids graduate from high school. Now, we know that there are some students who will not graduate from high school under a traditional timeline, and those plans are in place until they're at. And by the way, my K through 12 knowledge is rusty, but my memory of it is that as long as you're still in the high school, those plans are still valid. But once you've accepted the high school diploma, the plans are no longer valid. Now, what also causes some confusion is sometimes students can use those plans either as standalone or part of their documentation of their disability when they get to college, when they register for accommodations, and we ask them to document their disability. So sometimes people are confused because they've used that plan. And in some cases, maybe they've received exactly the same accommodations, and they think, well, so the college is following my plan. It doesn't really matter what they think as long as everything's going well for them. But what is important about that is for the families of students not yet at college to understand that colleges are not required to provide the same accommodations that students received in high school simply because they received them before. We are not subject to or have to follow those plans that they had in high school. So that's a really important distinction. And of course, what will determine whether or not they receive those accommodations are a couple of things. First of all, whether they are found eligible for those accommodations in the eyes of the college. And I don't want to scare people. And for a lot of students, this is not going to be an issue. They're going to get the same things. They'll be found eligible for the same accommodations. But that is true for students who are using the sort of general accommodations that you see in a lot of places. So if you want to dive right in, we could just do that.
Yeah. And kind of what I'm thinking of, I just kind of want to, again, reiterate what you're saying. You're basically saying that 504 plans and IEP plans basically expire when students graduate from high school.
Right.
But they can use the 504 plan and the IEP as additional support for the need for ongoing services that might look different in college. But they're really documenting that they've used these services or needed these accommodations early on. And they're using that to substantiate the continued need for some services moving forward. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it will depend. So the documentation issue, is wide ranging. So and colleges get to set their documentation requirements. The government sort of instructs us not to make them burdensome, but there's no real parameters for us. And so it can go everywhere from, if college A says your testing for a learning disability can't be, 3 years old in a day. To somebody to college B that says, as long as you provide us any evidence that you've received accommodations in the past or have some testing, we will take it. And there's no way to predict that. You can't guess that if you go to this kind of school, a Big Ten school, they'll require this. And if you go to a school that has a great culinary arts program, they'll require this, whatever it is. So the documentation requirements vary, and students and their parents can look those up online. So I always recommend, as students are doing their college search, that part of what they do when they are taking notes about different colleges is pop onto the Disability Services site and see what they require. And that will start to give them a sense, junior year of high school, what kinds of documentation they will need when they're done based on the colleges that they are hoping to attend.
Okay. And so it really sounds like it's really university or college dependent in terms of what's required.
That's
because,
correct.
a lot of parents will say, I've had testing done within the past 5 years. Do I have to get a reevaluation? But it sounds like it really depends on the university that you're applying to.
That's
Whereas one college might take an evaluation that's been done within the last 3 years. Another one might say, well, it has to be, it doesn't matter. That time limit doesn't matter.
That's correct. And some schools will take just a 504 plan or just an IEP. And I could not give you any general rules about how to know what it is. You just have to look it up online. I was going to say that I was doing a different podcast a couple of weeks ago, and somebody there mentioned with school psychologists, and one of them mentioned that a parent was concerned that the student needed to be tested senior year of high school so that the documentation would stay fresh, I guess, if you will, throughout the student's college experience. And again, there are literally thousands of colleges in the country, so I can't speak for everybody, but I think it's a pretty fair bet that students will not have to refresh their documentation or, provide something new, at least for learning disabilities and ADHD. And there may be different, conditions I'm not aware of where that might be different, but I don't generally have to update it while they're in college. They may be given temporary accommodations when they initially register with us based on, if the college doesn't find their documentation to be sufficient in some way. And in that time, they might have to go do an update. But it's not the kind of thing where if you start with something freshman year, by senior year, you have to do that again.
Okay. So it really has to do, again, the universities that you're applying to. So maybe even a good strategy would be to, when you're thinking about applying to universities, see what the documentation is that is required, like you mentioned, and make note of those timeframes in terms of how recent the documentation or the evaluation needs to be, or if they will just take an IEP or a 504 plan and you don't need a reevaluation.
Right.
But just to make sure you're covering all your bases in terms of the schools that you want to attend.
And to be clear, just because we've gotten into the paperwork end of this, the documentation of your disability does not start until you get into college and enroll someplace. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about the application process at all.
Yes, I would love to. Let's do that, because I think another thing that I'm thinking about is the reports. Mm-hmm. And I know that you review a number of reports for accommodations, and parents who are thinking now about updating the testing and getting it done. Maybe it's been 10 years since they've had an evaluation and they're thinking, okay, now we're applying to college for the next academic year. We want to update the testing. What are some things that you are looking for in reports as someone who reviews these? Mm-hmm. I know we've had conversations about what is a good private testing report. What should it contain? What's important for colleges to have? What information is important for colleges to have in order to make the determination that a student needs accommodations?
Right. So, and I do want to start by saying, and I know you do private reports, I have seen parents tell each other, oh, don't use the school report. You need to go get private testing. And that's absolutely not true. So I think that there are good reasons to get private reports, and those, are family-based issues to me. But the idea that simply by going to get private testing, your student will get more accommodations or better accommodations is not something that you should rely on. And so
I completely agree with you.
And, some of my favorite psychologists, including Dr. Karen Wilson and some other folks I know, are the first to say, if you can get school testing and that's going to do the job, you should do that. So, this is not necessarily a situation where you need to go pay out of pocket to go do something. So when it comes to learning disabilities, again, if the college requires testing and they aren't just going to be to find that the high school plan sufficient, they'll generally just require what the two elements of a psychoeducational evaluation. So cognitive testing with a recognized battery that people, generally use. And again, not the extended battery of every, all 20 subtests that they offer, but the standard battery that you would expect to see. And the same for an achievement battery. So as long as those are done for a lot of students, that will be sufficient. And of course, Karen, it's not just that you literally have testing.
Right.
The testing needs to give evidence of a disability. So, I think most people don't get to the point of testing without there being something to probe. And not that means every single student who gets assessed for a disability has one, but, it should be, that's at least what they're going to be looking for. And again, you mentioned sometimes students haven't been tested since second grade. And look, we do know that learning disabilities don't go away. They don't magically disappear. But colleges want to be able to make an assessment of a student's need based on slightly current information. And second grade, I think most of us would agree, really doesn't meet that standard. And so while you can always provide additional evidence if you want. Student on the registration form can say, I've been tutored with Orton Gillingham, throughout high school. I mean, nobody really does that unless they've been very late identified, but, provide some additional support to show that these are, you're self-accommodating or you had this kind of support, are just, additional pieces that students can always put in their documentation as well. So back to your initial question is certainly if you're going for a private evaluation, I would expect that person to do a really thorough history. And especially on a student who's not been identified until later in their education. Certainly we know that students can go fly under the radar, as they say. They self-accommodate, or people are doing things, without all sort of talking to each other. They're being informally accommodated by various teachers. Parents are providing the structure at home. But what you need to look at is if this all poof went away, what would the student look like and what would that experience be? And so, tracking what was the developmental trajectory like when they were young and they were acquiring those basic skills? Did they receive tutoring, or supports? What kinds of things were done so that even though, there's no formal accommodation history, you see that breadcrumb trail that you realize if somebody had taken the whole picture and really looked at it, they would have identified that student. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important. And then, behavioral observations. Does the student, tap her fingers the whole time? Is that anxiety? Is it attention? Is she just trying to stay focused? Does she ask for questions to be repeated constantly because she wasn't paying attention or her working memory is not, keeping up with things? All those details are helpful. Obviously, describing when the student takes the test, what kinds of things are you seeing? Does she get the easy questions wrong and the hard questions correct because she's not, giving it her full attention? All those details really make the best case, for a student who needs accommodations. So I would expect any qualified, professional to be providing those kinds of reports. And then summarize it. Look, to toggle back to the school districts, sometimes when you go on these websites, it'll say that there must be evidence and there must be a diagnosis and it has to have the DSM code or the ICD code. Don't panic. Often they will say this in part because sometimes they get reports where there's really no evidence and sometimes the psychologist doesn't really come right out and say it wasn't a disability, it was just, some mild weaknesses or whatever. Mm-hmm. But don't assume that your student won't be able to get accommodated because the school districts don't provide those codes. My guess is a lot of the documentation they see is from school districts, and they're fine with that. So, one thing I guess to add to your advice about looking at documentation requirements while the students are at least putting together their college list is don't panic. Don't assume that there's no flexibility in what you see. So, that's it for learning disabilities. Now, ADHD. runs a wide range of things that are required. Everything from, just a note from if it was a pediatrician who diagnosed it, to maybe a form that doctor fills out if you're being treated with meds, and we know not everybody is. But some schools, not all of them, I can't give you a percentage, will require either a psychoed or sometimes a neuropsych. So these are things to just have on your radar. But again, you don't do anything until the student has been accepted to that school and decided to enroll there, because you may not need it.
Okay, that's really great information, because you don't want people to incur costs that they don't need.
No, or put students through this stuff. I mean, nobody's ever walked out of a neuropsych, or maybe I shouldn't assume, maybe they do, and said, wow, that was so much fun. I can't wait to come back and do that again. Right. But you do the testing. I bet they like being.
All the people come to see me do.
I was going to say.
I'm just joking.
Obviously, I spoke too soon.
But this is really great information. This is really great information, because you're kind of outlining what parents can expect. And really, they have to do their due diligence and check and see whether or not the schools that they're applying to, that they're considering, require just a high school plan or a high school plan plus recent reporting or a recent assessment. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, from what I've heard from schools that have received reports, is that they want to know the extent to which the difficulties that are showing up in these reports and in that student's daily life is impacting their academic performance. So it's not enough to do the cognitive testing and say that there's a weakness in working memory. Mm-hmm. You want to know, how does this impact them in the college setting? And what does this mean for them in terms of what they need in terms of accommodations?
I think that's really important. And especially when we see severe weaknesses, we would expect that there would be some sort of impact on that. The student who every time the parents give them a chore to do has to come back 15 times and say, what'd you tell me to do again? So, obviously testing is just a snapshot of a student on a particular day or two, but you would expect to see the impact of that elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
And that's why the history is so important. Like you were saying, you want the early history, and you also want to know kind of what's been happening now in these last couple of years of high school in terms of modifications and accommodations that have been helpful or needed for that student in order to be successful. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the services that are available. So we've talked about the fact that, your IEP and your 504 plan expire. You may be eligible for services in college. What are some typical support services that are available to students in college?
So there are some real basic things that right off the bat are the things I think a lot of parents and students are aware of. So extended time for tests. There's this weird math we do where we say, often the kind of industry standard, if you will, is 1.5 times or 1.5 times. So if your class has 2 hours to take an exam, if you have time and a half, you get 3 hours. And some students believe that more time is better, so they can certainly ask for double time. It all depends. Some schools are good and just say, if that's what you had in the past, we are good with that as long as, we do see evidence of a disability. Others may be a little bit more particular about looking to see whether they agree that double time is indeed necessary. And again, there's no cognitive science that came up with the number time and a half at some point. That's just sort of the way we do things. And so that's a pretty common accommodation. But what I think, too, if I can just take this moment, one of the things I really like to emphasize in my writing and my presentations are the vocabulary of college of disability services. And I think this is a good place to start doing that. So every place I've worked, students have come in asking for untimed exams. Well, we literally have to do untimed if we say yes, which is why students are most likely going to get a specific amount of time. And this isn't like a bad game show where if you ask for the wrong thing, you get the big red X and you don't get anything. But I think what's good about this is if professionals who work with these students can start to introduce these ideas and introduce the vocabulary so that it becomes familiar and students know what to expect. So again, every place I've worked, students have asked for a private room for testing. Well, if you attend a small private school, Where it's 10 kids in a class, perhaps it would be very easy for them to give you a private room to do that. But universities are often struggling for space at any given time. So I know there are schools, I've never worked at one, that have actual testing centers. And so in those situations, I don't even know whether those are, rooms or carols or how that works. But often you're just in a different room than the rest of your class with a proctor and perhaps 3 other students who are taking freshman chemistry, who all have the same professor at different times, and they're all taking that professor's exam at that time. So those are pretty common things. Students can ask for permission to use a calculator for exams. Although often in college math classes, and I never took one, but I understand that they are often required to have these crazy calculators with 50 buttons. So that might not even be something they need, but they should always ask for it in case for some reason a professor doesn't typically allow that. A laptop for exams, in-class exams, for students with severe spelling problems, with dysgraphia, fine motor issues where the handwriting is indecipherable, should ask for that. Again, there shouldn't really be, in a lot of cases, a reason why they couldn't have it, although it's a good time to just sort of put a pin in this for a second and scooch over to the side to say, you started by saying what kinds of things can they expect, and these are the things that are generally available. But what sometimes happens, and the reason students sometimes don't receive the accommodations that they had in high school, are because of a couple of the rules that apply to colleges as far as what we don't have to do. So things like, I brought up the calculator and the laptop, because sometimes there might be a class in which part of what is being measured is the ability to spell terminology correctly, because it's important for that field, or to do the calculations in your head. And I can't think of any particular examples, but in those cases, if a professor objects and says, this is an alteration to my objectives, after a review process, not just on the professor say so, it might be found that can't be allowed. But I don't think that these kinds of things that I'm talking about are typically, ruled out. Permission to record lectures is something that is commonly given for students with note-taking difficulties. And sometimes students, don't need permission to have their laptops in class. Sometimes professors have laptop bans. But if it's found that a student needs to have a laptop in order to be able to take notes efficiently, professors generally can't say no, unless, again, there's a reason why. So laptop, note-taking, sometimes they get copies of notes from a classmate. This is a situation where these things are different too. Sometimes in high school, teachers have given them a copy of notes. I have seen some parents tell me that their kid indeed did get notes from a professor, but more often it's a peer note taker in the class, and you just get a copy of the peer note takers.
Okay. So it sounds like extended time on tests, the use of a calculator, a laptop, recording lectures, note taking. Those are some support services that are typically available to students in college.
Right.
Parents often ask about a reader. Can you speak about a reader and even a reader pen? Because, those have been more common recently for students with dyslexia.
So, yeah, and that's great. And I love to hear about students using assistive technology. So back to one of those exceptions that the law provides is we don't have to provide a personal reader or a reader for personal study. So if a student is taking an exam in class, obviously, and that student has a reading disability, perhaps we would load a laptop with reading software, text-to-speech software like Read and Write Gold. And the exam would be loaded in there, and the exam would read it aloud to the student. Or if they use a scan pen, and I just haven't seen a lot of those where I work, that might be the accommodation instead for the exam. Now, are there places where a human being is reading the exam to students? Probably. I don't know how common that is instead of the assistive technology piece. But for time outside of exams, we actually don't have to provide the personal reader. And what's also really important, I'm so glad you brought this up, is if a student needs read and write gold again to read the text aloud, we don't have to buy them the software. So what we do have to do is make sure that the texts that they need are in a format that can be read by that. So back to freshman chemistry, what we might do first is approach the publisher to see if freshman chemistry text is in an accessible, is already in a computerized, an e-form, and get it directly from the publisher that way for the student. And they still have to buy a copy of the book. Nobody gets books for free at college. It's just the accessible part that we would do for them without a charge. Or if that book doesn't exist in electronic form, we would generally scan the book for them using optical character recognition software so that their program could do that. Now, one of the things parents can look at, and students, I should say, together while they are doing these college searches, is some schools actually have Read and Write Gold or another program loaded into the whole university system. So you don't even need to be registered with our office to get access to it. And I've spoken to students at least 2 universities where that was true. So that's another thing they can look at while they're checking out services.
That is really great. And I think it's also important to make a distinction between, I know we've talked about this, extended time for tests and exams and extra time for assignments, because sometimes that has been the accommodation or the modification in high school.
Right.
Can you talk about what that looks like, or may not be available to students?
Right. And this is one of those places where, again, the nuance can get lost in these online lists. If you go to some website that says, best accommodations for students at college, and it will say extended time, but it doesn't specifically say extended time for tests. So extensions for deadlines is not a common accommodation for students with LD and ADHD. Often when students get that accommodation, they are either students with a severe psychological or physical condition that has flare-ups. So if, a student with a severe psychological disorder has, flare-ups where, he is unable to function for a short period of time, in that moment, that student might get an extension on a paper that's due then. But those students don't generally get 3 days every time a paper is assigned, is what we call sometimes a blanket accommodation. And sometimes those students will have to notify, their liaison at Disability Services and the professor at the time to say, I know this paper is due tomorrow. I am having, whatever kind of episode, and I'm unable to finish this. I don't get involved in those kinds of accommodations, but yeah, extensions for papers and projects for students with poor time management, poor executive functioning, slow processing they're not common. So obviously, again, I can't speak for every university in every situation. And, one thing that's important is these decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. So if, somebody might have a student getting that at Hamlet University, but, the other student coming to my college doesn't get it. So, but what's really important about that, when we talk about looking toward the future, is it's important to know what kinds of accommodations are commonly available or not, so that the high school planning includes getting students accustomed to managing their own time and learning how to break down assignments and, putting aside the time that they need if they are slow processors, slow writers, whatever, to get stuff done by a certain deadline so that they feel confident going to college, that they know how to do this stuff and they are ready for it, especially in case they don't get that kind of accommodation. And I think, the confidence is something that's really important to me. And, it's not good news for anybody when a student finds out when they get to college that they can't have an accommodation they were relying on. So, for them to go and know what to expect.
Right. I think the point about being self-confident is really important. And I'm thinking about those students who are making that transition from high school to college. And it's also important in order to build that confidence is to help them become more independent. And it seems like that process actually should begin very early on so that they're becoming more and more independent over time and therefore better prepared for that transition to college. And the other piece of that is really preparing them to self-advocate because no more, are their parents going to be getting the information and advocating on their behalf and taking them to the appointments and making sure that they have everything that they need in order to be successful. They're going to have to take care of that themselves and make those arrangements for accommodations themselves. And I think that we really have to prepare students again for that transition to more independence and self-advocacy.
I mean, let's go on the road together, Karen. You said it better than I could. All of those things are absolutely true. And look, the research shows us that students who are successful in college tend to have supportive parents. And so every parent struggles. I shouldn't assume a lot of parents struggle with knowing where the line is between being supportive and providing more support than is, helpful to students. But I think it's really important to look at the amount of support students are getting in high school from adults and see what you can start to scale back. And maybe it's not freshman year of high school because, that's a transition too, as we know, moving from middle school to high school. But there should be a long-term plan for scaling back accommodations that aren't common at college, but also making sure before that happens that somebody's teaching the students the skills they need, as you say, to be independent and to self-advocate. So, some other things that don't happen commonly at college. I just saw a parent the other day in this Facebook group that I run say that in high school, teachers were providing guided notes for her student, during lectures. And that is not the kind of thing that often happens. Students are expected, unless they're getting copies of notes from note takers, but to take their own notes. They don't usually get to say, well, I don't like to take essay exams. I only want multiple choice exams. Or I don't do well on exams at all. I want to write a paper. Or I don't like to write papers. I need to do projects. So if those kinds of, and that's where we use the word modification, when you're really changing the expectation for what students are doing. So if a student starts high school with modifications in place, see what you can do to teach them the skills to get them to meet the requirements, the expectations, I should say, for that other students are meeting. And, if that's not appropriate for that student, then that's also a discussion to have. And then also a talk about what happens after high school, because immediate transition to a traditional four-year college environment might not be the first step right after that. So I think, again, you talked about self-confidence. I think, I'm interested in self-efficacy and students, where a student believes that they can do well. And so they do the things that help them achieve success, which feeds more success, which feeds their belief that they can do well. So I think, I think students are really smart. And I think that they know when they are receiving an awful lot of help at home, at school. And I don't want them to leave the cradle of high school, don't think of it that way, for college, worried how they're going to do without all those supports. And, colleges don't typically provide learning disability specialists like myself. Or if they do, it's through a paid program, like, one of the best known is the University of Arizona's SALT program. But there's an extra fee for that. It's not support every single day of the week. Students are expected to make and keep their own appointments, things like that. So it's so much better to, scale things back as they go, let them have some experiences, learn how to self-manage, and that way they can leave with the confidence that they need.
That's amazing and so critical. And it makes me think of the calls that I love to get about preparing and transitioning to college. And those are the calls that don't come from the parents, they come from the students.
Oh, that's
the student who contacts me, who I, evaluated when he was 5 and when he was 15, and now he's got accepted to university, who calls and says, Dr. Wilson, you evaluated me 5 years ago, and I'm applying. I just got accepted into college A, and they need me to update my testing. Can I schedule that with you?
Oh, wow.
And that is such a great moment because I know, again, when you talk about self-efficacy, that this student has reached a point of independence where they are very able and ready to advocate for themselves. He knows what he needs and he's reaching out on his own behalf to get his needs met. And those are the best calls that I get.
I bet they are. That's terrific. Yeah. I mean, students handling their own stuff. I mean, lots of people suggest really anybody transitioning to college should start managing their own doctor's appointments, picking up their own prescriptions, things like that. But yeah, to make that call for the testing is really amazing. That's cool.
So is there anything else you think would be helpful for families to know as they prepare for this transition to college for their kids, their young adults?
Well, I mean, as far as the transition, I think you've certainly spoken to the importance of, the independence. And look, I know that parents of students with disabilities have often spent, kind of their students' lifetime worrying about them and worrying about how things will go at college. There are a lot of students who are neurotypical who make some stumbles going to college. It is a different environment. And so, I think you and your student will feel most confident if you are able to get to the point by senior year where you're watching them do things on their own and they're feeling, and it won't always be a success every single time, but that's also true for their typical peers too, right? It's all a part of growing up. And you did that wonderful web chat for me this summer that folks can find on my YouTube channel on emerging adulthood and high school grads and what that looks like. So that's another great resource for parents to look at. So I think, looking at the level of support, looking at the accommodations that they're receiving, trying to make a plan by senior year for them to perhaps, if it's appropriate for them, be utilizing only the kinds of accommodations they'll receive in college. I'd be worried a lot less about the grades that they're going to achieve with certain supports than I would about how they will handle themselves without the kinds of things that they may not receive in college. I think that's really important. And in case we didn't say this clearly enough, when it comes to the application for college, we had talked about paperwork and documentation. None of that has to go to the admissions office. Students don't have to send in their paperwork to ask about accommodations until they are enrolled. And certainly as far as applying to colleges and writing their essay and is there anything else you want us to know about you, students should make their own decision about whether they want to mention their disability. I don't do admissions work as part of my job, but my friends who do always say it should be the student's choice. But what I want to be clear about is if they decide not to, that doesn't mean they can't apply for accommodations once they get in and enroll. Those processes have nothing to do with each other. And also, really importantly, because every once in a while I talk to somebody who says, oh, a parent sent in an IEP with the student's application. Mm-hmm. Admissions is not going to forward that to our office probably. They're not probably going to use that to make any decisions. They, in a lot of places, won't have any idea whether the school could support that student. So talking about the disability, if the student wants to do it, is extremely appropriate. But sending the actual documentation is not the way to do that.
Okay. Great points and great tips for parents. I mean, all of this information that you shared is such wonderful information for parents who are preparing their young people to make that transition from high school to college. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, your expertise with our listeners. Now, I know that people are going to want to get in touch with you to get more information. I'm going to definitely put links to your website in the show notes, but please let people know what is the best way to connect with you.
Thanks for asking, and thanks for this opportunity too. I love any opportunity I can find to get parents this information. So on my website, which you'll link to, it's called ldadvisory.com. There's a contact link, and that's probably the easiest way for a lot of people. Or you can follow me on Twitter or on Facebook, and you can message me through any of those platforms. But I love to hear from families. And if I don't have the answer, I'll try to send you some information that does answer your question or send you to the person who has the answer for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This was a great conversation. And as always, I love chatting with you because I'm always learning something new that helps me when I'm preparing students for that transition. So thank you again. And I can't wait to have you back.
Can't wait to come back. Thanks again.
I can't wait to hear what you thought about this episode. Let me know if the information shared was helpful by sending me a direct message on Instagram at Child Nexus Community. I also want you to know that Elizabeth is giving listeners a 50% discount off her book, From High School to College, Steps to Success for Students with Disabilities. All you need to do is email her at echamblett, Hamblet, at ldadvisory.com and give her the code word Child Nexus, Child Nexus, and she will send you the information you need to get her book. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to come back next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.